In this video, we're going to talk about some of the basic physics that you need to understand to actually understand exercise at its fundamental level. So first things first, physics can be intimidating, but we really only need to know a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of real physics to understand what might be helpful in the context of exercise. So first and foremost, a couple words we'll throw out just to begin with are torque and moment arm. Those you really have to have in terms of describing them to in the same conversation. So torque, if any of you have heard of this, which if you have, it's probably been incorrectly used on social media. Torque is essentially a force's effectiveness, right? So torque in and of itself is not a force. I've often heard it referred to as a twisting force. Forces don't twist, right? They're linear in nature. Torque is really the quality of a force or the quality of a resistance, and in that resistance effectiveness on us, okay? So we're gonna go over tons of examples, so don't worry if you're confused at the wording here. But torque is essentially the product of force itself, right? So that could just be a dumbbell that you're holding, multiplied, or the product of a force and what's called a moment arm. So many of you have heard of moment arm before, maybe, and moment arm is essentially perpendicular distance, okay? So if I have an axis here, and I have a board, we'll pretend this is a board of wood and this is a fixed axis, right? So this is kind of like where that board is rotating around. Hopefully you can picture that. Maybe picture like a windshield wiper, right? This whole thing is pivoting around this point. And I apply a force to this board. Let's say I push on it that way, okay? There's going to be some distance from that line of force, from that direction of force, to the axis around which that thing is rotating, okay? So the human body is made of levers and pulleys and axes and those kinds of things. So this may seem like an unrelated example, but it's directly related to the examples that we're going to talk about. So if I push on this thing this way, and let's just say that, like, you know, this was the point of application that I was pushing it at, okay, and this is the arrow that comes away from that, you can kind of look at the scenario and you're like, well, I don't really see a distance that I can draw that's 90 degrees from this arrow and this joint axis, or this axis, whatever we're calling it. And I kind of gave it away earlier, but what we can do is we can actually extend that line of force. This is supposed to be a straight line. We can just ignore it. And then we can look at, okay, what is the horizontal distance or the perpendicular distance, that 90-degree distance from this point. Now, this is going to start out as like seemingly arbitrary, but let's get into a few examples as to how this may actually apply when we are looking at the human body. So instead of visualizing this as just a wooden board that's just floating around in space, let's give the example of a dumbbell curl, okay? In the dumbbell curl, this is my shoulder, this is my elbow, and this is my forearm, and this is where I'm holding the dumbbell. And let's just say that I have like a preacher support, right? So here's a pad, right? And I'm kind of resting on this preacher support, okay? So at every point in the range, this dumbbell just wants to fall to the ground. So what we would typically think of, and I'll maybe just remove this big circle so it's easier to see here, right? Dumbbell's in the hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw an arrow directly downward. So hopefully the camera's picking that up. I think it is. And so again, the force of the dumbbell just wants to fall to the ground. If I drop this marker, it falls to the ground. Only will it move in some weird direction if I throw it that way or if I throw it this way, which, in terms of this video and the contents of this video, I want to avoid for now. That's, a conversation around inertia, which gets a little bit more complex. But when we're looking at force direction in terms of a dumbbell curl, and we're looking at it from this 90-degree perspective, meaning like this is 90 degrees from where I'm moving. If I were looking at you here, the camera would be in the same exact sort of plane or direction that I'm moving. So what I want to do is I want to look at something directly from the side. In this case, we're looking at a curl. And again, much like in that board example, what I'm going to do to actually find the moment arm is I'm going to draw that line up, and now I'm going to draw this horizontal distance. Okay, so hopefully that's maybe starting to make more sense. And if we're actually going through the range of this curl, and I'm going to erase this because it's going to get in the way, what we can see is that the moment arm, or the distance, which again heavily affects how much torque is actually imposed on the body, the moment arm will change. So let's say now that the weight was up here and the weight was falling directly downward. Now what we would see is that this horizontal distance to the elbow is actually much shorter. It's almost like half the length that it was before. And people understand this and experience this intuitively, where like at the bottom of a curl, maybe if I'm standing, right, that weight is kind of just hanging at my side. It's not doing very much. And as I curl and I go maybe to 90 degrees, right, that weight is really far away from me. So the whole point of this is to really say that the longer this distance, the farther something is away from whatever joint that you're talking about, the more torque is going to be imposed on whatever joint or joints you're looking at. So when we look at the elbow is a very simple example to look at because it's a hinge joint, it only moves in one direction. It's easier to see, which is why I used it as an example. But when we start to look at presses and pulls and pull downs and all those kinds of things, there's more moving parts, there are more things to actually look at, and you have to look at them from different perspectives. So this was merely just an introduction to torque and what torque is and what moment arm is. And so we can really just understand that torque is the effectiveness of a force, right? So in essence, the weight of the dumbbell, let's say if now it's out here at 90 degrees, okay, here's the weight, right? So this distance in terms of this position up here down to this position, the weight itself, the 10 pounds on this dumbbell didn't change, right? So 10 pounds here, 10 pounds here, didn't change, right? In other words, the F or the force part of this equation didn't actually, that's sort of our dependent variable if you want to call it that. What did change was the distance that this dumbbell was away from the elbow. So in this instance, right, it was literally twice as far from this axis in terms of the force direction. And in this instance, it was, half of that distance, meaning that this 10 pounds, if it were imposing, 50 newtons of force in this position, was imposing 25 in this other, right? These are random numbers, random units, right? But hopefully that sort of starts to illustrate some of the point here. Okay, so that's torque, that's moment arm. And to maybe use another example that may be more obvious in terms of the actual sensation and the experience is imagine that instead of doing a curl, you were doing a dumbbell lateral raise, right? And so imagine this were my dumbbell. The dumbbell 10 pounds at my side doesn't really do very much, right? It kind of just wants to pull my shoulder downward. But as soon as now I raise it up to the side, we all intuitively know that like this distance is much bigger, this horizontal distance, and even something halfway up would be much more significantly loaded than something that was directly below my shoulder. So in this case, the force direction would be going directly up and down through my shoulder. And in this case, it's literally 90 degrees from that point. So all of us intuitively experience that like this is a much harder position with a dumbbell than this is, but this is why. Okay, torque is why, and understanding what torque is and why it's important will allow us to look deeper into these other concepts around exercise that we can actually use to make better decisions and understand exercise at a more fundamental level than just, oh, this is a thing that does this thing to our muscles. Okay, so hopefully this was a helpful introduction. If you want to learn more, in depth about all these topics, I have an entire section that's dedicated to the basic physics of exercise in my online course. So if you're interested, definitely check out the link in the description. I have several hours of content just on this stuff to dive more in depth into it. But hopefully, if you haven't heard about these concepts before, this was a simple and easy to understand introduction. Definitely ask me any questions in the comment section if I didn't explain anything particularly well, or if you want me to explain on any of the points that I made here.